Good morning. So Evanston is a town about like Waukegan, 80,000 people or so, 600 kids who are homeless in the school system, probably about 100, 150 people homeless every night. And it has a underserved kind of system in place, although we've spent many years trying to improve it and do things with it. Some of the things that we have done is there has been, as John mentioned, a major change in our emphasis away from shelter and towards housing. So I think the reason that John wanted me to talk today is really to say something about that shift. I took over Connections, I guess about 11 years ago. Connections was the principal organization in Evanston responsible for working with the homeless. The YWCA works with families and single individuals who are experiencing domestic violence, so they're part of the system as well. But we're the ones that had the shelter, worked with people on the street, and tried to do what we could to decrease the street population, which is always a concern. We also had family housing, and we made a lot of different efforts to kind of experiment with different ways of going about this process. I began an experiment really at Connections about 10 years ago. Well, it'd be a bit less than that, 8 years ago. We had a shelter. When I first arrived, we had a shelter that served about 45 people a night. And they were staying very long periods of time. I mean, the average length of stay was about 180 days. So when I arrived, I have a long background working with the homeless going back to the mid-70s. And it didn't make much sense what was going on in Evanston. So I just arbitrarily said, okay, we're cutting this. We're cutting the size of the shelter in half, and we're going to serve twice the number of people. And that may seem counterintuitive, but that's in fact what we did. We cut the population in half, the nightly population in half, and then we just focused on getting them served, so that the average length of stay went from 180 to 90 to 60 to 45 to around 30. And even with 20 beds, if you're recycling people through there 10 times a year, you're up to 200 people a year being served, as opposed to 90 are being served when you've got a 45-bed shelter and people are staying 6 months. So that was the first thing, was to simply get serious and focused on trying to move people out of their homelessness. Now the second thing, and this was a harder sell, and I confess it is still a hard sell, but the idea of shelter. I remember opening my first shelter in New York in 1982, and I confess it took me about 2 weeks to realize that, first of all, people who are living in shelter are still homeless. So you haven't really done anything. You've made a comfortable night for people to stay. You've taken them away from some dangers and things like that, but you haven't done anything to the issue of homelessness. And so the only thing that you can really do if you want to do something about ending homelessness is you have to get them out of shelter, off the street, and into housing. And so back in those days, there weren't any federal programs, and we went around, begged a lot for money, and created our own kind of Section 8 program to move people into what are called single-room occupancy hotels. There used to be a lot around. There aren't many left in the country. But that was actually a fairly successful program. It worked pretty well. And then as things began to happen in New York, federal money started coming in. We started building housing, doing larger projects and things. So when I arrived at Connections in Evanston, I thought, well, we got to do something like that. I mean, we're not New York City. They're 8 million, we're 80,000. We're not going to have the resources that they have, but we can do something. And so we started focusing on the things that we could do to somehow get people quickly through the shelter. And I confess that even in the early days, for the first 20 years of my work with homeless, or 25 years, I believed really in this continuum of care. This notion that, you get people off the street, you get them into shelter, you get them into transitional housing, you get them into permanent housing, and it's very orderly. It's very nice and orderly. The problem was, by about 1990, it was clear to me that it didn't work. And it didn't work, and I should have known better. I spent about a year living in a shelter, so I knew pretty well what the mentality was of living in a shelter. And living in a shelter was really an experience where you learn to navigate all kinds of systems within the shelter. And virtually none of that is transferable to living on your own. And that, I think, was the lesson that I began to learn. And so even in New York, I began getting to the point where I would stop pushing people into shelter. The idea was to try and, yes, there was a shelter, so we put people in, but let's not let them linger for long. So when I got to Evanston, and there we are spending 180 days on people, and they're going out, becoming homeless again, another 180 days, and they're going out, becoming homeless again. It just didn't make any sense whatsoever. So in addition to shutting down the size of the shelter, focusing more on the people who were there and getting them into housing, I began another experiment. And that other experiment was, how many people could we move directly from the street into housing? Now, mind you, Connections for the Homeless, is the name of the organization, it was known for its shelter, Hilda's Place. This is how people identified. This is why people gave money. And so the board wasn't particularly happy with the idea of me trying to bypass the shelter because, in fact, it was our gravy train. It was our way of attracting money and bringing it in. So I made one attempt to try and do away with it early in my stay there, and then I didn't succeed. So I went ahead, kept the shelter full, and at the same time we started focusing on moving people directly off the street. And so in the course of a year, we were somewhere around 65, 75 people would flow through the shelter and go into permanent housing, and somewhere around 75 to 80 people would go directly from the street into housing. And after a number of years, I was able to finally look at the data and say, okay, what's the success rate? What's the recidivism rate? What's the number of people coming back in? This statistic up here is very impressive, to tell you the truth, of only 108 people coming back into the system. And I know that it's difficult to live on your own when you haven't lived on your own, been responsible for rent for many years, if ever. So there's always going to be a certain amount of flow back. And I guess what I was surprised was that there was no difference, literally no difference, between the population that went directly from the street into permanent housing and those who went through the shelter, even though the shelter was where we gave them all our best. We gave them safety, we gave them support, we gave them instruction, we gave them all kinds of things that were going to be valuable to them when they moved into housing on their own. But what we found was that they failed at just the same rate as the people who went directly from the street into housing. So I said to myself, oh, well, there's got to be an explanation for this, because certainly all of this stuff that we're doing for people has some value added. And I started looking at the underlying data, and I thought, well, it must be because the people that are coming in the shelter are the more difficult. the ones who have mental illness or are substance abusing, and we have to work harder with them. But in fact, what I found was that our staff had actually been biasing against them, because individuals with severe mental illness have great difficulty in surviving in a shelter. It's just not a very good environment to be in, and if you're dealing with paranoia or some kind of mental illness, it's very difficult to be around 20, 30 other people in very close quarters. So what I found was that we were dealing with the harder people straight from the street into housing than the people who were in the shelter, and yet we were having the same success rate, or maybe the same failure rate. There was really no difference. So it made me begin to ask the question, why am I spending $500,000 a year to bring people into this shelter? And I'm afraid to say that the reason was because our funders wanted to feel good about providing shelter. In truth, I could not justify that as a reasonable explanation for why we should maintain that shelter. Now, I'm late 60s, probably older than John, and I got very tired. and so I did retire last year. And I am sad to say that Connections has opened up their shelter again. And they no longer house 150 people a year, 160, 170 people a year. They house many less. I think that there are so many counterintuitive things that go on in the way we address the issue of homelessness. We address it in what we think is rational, and it is. It makes logical sense. Shelter makes logical sense. But it doesn't work if what we're trying to do is end homelessness. One of the things that, and I won't go on for much longer, but one of the things I just want to bring into the conversation, I'm sure it will come up later. One of the things I always argued in Evanston is I would go before the city board and I'd say, look, you know, we as a city are generating homeless people every year. We're generating homeless families. You want to know why there are 600 kids in the school district that are homeless? Look at your rents. Look at your rents. Who can afford to live here anymore? New York City, I'm ashamed to say, I was there in the beginning when the consent decree was passed. I was on the board of the New York Coalition for the Homeless in 1980. We all thought this was a great victory to require the city to provide shelter. What were there, 58,000 people in the shelter last night in New York? I mean, think of that. It's astonishing. It hasn't gotten any better in New York because no one can afford to live in New York. Who can who can afford rents of $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000? So unless you're willing to do something about that, you will always have homelessness. And I'm sad to say, but this country, just as a general rule, is pushing people out of housing because we won't make the changes that are needed to happen in order to make housing affordable. Now, there are a lot of other things. You'll hear from Mark and others about the importance of case management and support services and things like that. It's all true. But really, at the heart of this is the entire issue of affordability and housing. So that's my little speech. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Paul's here, and certainly controversial, is he not? So I'm going to take 2 questions from the audience and 2 questions from political officials for Paul.
Paul, could you talk a little bit about the collaboration with the churches in Evanston, the support from the Evanston city, and
Yes. So the churches have been great, with this one caveat, I would say, which is that shelter is a very important thing. Shelter and soup kitchens are kind of what the churches do. If they don't provide the shelter, then they are supporting it with volunteers and money and things like that. And it's very difficult. I had this conversation almost on a weekly basis when I would say, why don't we put our money that's going into shelter and that you want to give to shelter, and why don't we put it into housing? But what are all those people who are out on the street tonight? What are they going to do? And I'd say, well, we've got somewhere around 200 people who are homeless tonight in Evanston, and we're taking care of about 20 of them. So there are 120 who are out on the street tonight, regardless of whether you give it to a shelter or not. What about those 120 people? So the churches have been wonderful with this one problem. It's just very difficult for them to get over the idea that the shelter is necessary and that housing, it's just been hard for them to make that leap. And with respect to the police, the Evanston police have the same problems that every other police department in the state and the country really have, particularly with respect to the homeless. They have some officers who are community, I forget, there's a special name for it, but anyway. Liaison. Okay, good term. So but they go out and they wander around the community. They're on bikes. They're on their feet, and they're terrific. They're really terrific. They know all the homeless people that we know, and they work with us all the time. So that has been a very successful collaboration between the two. Now, are there times where we're trying to protect someone that they're trying to find? Probably. But for the most part, we're in dialogue with them on a regular basis. I talk we as if I'm still there, but anyway, that's it. Okay.
Sure, can you come up a little bit because you're I can't get it all the way over there.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Maria. And sir, you mentioned something about the homeless with mental disabilities. So that's true. They cannot come in with the whole population right there because of trouble. There is some way they can go, because even though they cannot go for themselves, obviously, because they are mental disability, because I know one of them in a certain neighborhood here in Waukegan, between Waukegan and North Chicago. Another thing is how they can handle about, like you said, addicted people. Because I hear two histories, because I was working with the community in Waukegan some years ago. I worked for the community 8.5 years. And I hear two histories in different times. One for a lady who was in the shelter. She preferred to go to the family shelters but they wanna transfer to her for a single shelter. And she was terribly scared because she said, I cannot go there because I saw people with drugs, I saw people with knives, and I don't like to go there. So another people, it was a man around 2 years ago, was in the winter of 2014. He was in the 50s, and he said also in winter time, I said, you gotta go to the shelter. He said, I don't wanna go to the shelter, I prefer to sleep in the park because I saw drug people and knife people, with a knife, I mean.
Great, thank you. It is interesting, I wrote that particular question down as something I ought to address, and let me, how do I put this? You have more experts here about mental illness than me. Although I've worked with people with mental illness for 40 years, Let me just address this one issue, because mental illness is an enormous issue, and people can be disabled by mental illness, and that doesn't mean that they can't do anything. It really doesn't. You know, going back to my example of the people who we moved directly from the street in, they were the ones who were mentally ill, and they survived just as well in housing on their own with support as those who went through the shelter and got all this wonderful support. But it's this issue of talking to homeless people who would rather stay in the park than in a shelter that always astonishes people. Say, oh my goodness, you know, we can't do anything for these people because they really want to be where they are. It isn't that I have not heard that. I've heard, I mean, I can be in a group of homeless people, and they'll be talking about the bums that are out on the street. They're like the rest of us. They're as prejudiced as the rest of us, and they have as many misguided ideas as the rest of us. So we shouldn't look at them as having PhDs in homelessness, because they don't. But one of the things that I think became very, very clear to me in working for so many years with people, particularly on the street, is when you're homeless, you have no future. You live today. And your problem is tonight. And your problem is food. And that's it. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about how to solve the problems of the world. You're trying to figure out how to get through today to tomorrow. And when you find that place that you can go to that night, you don't tell everyone about it because you don't want other people to take it. You take it. And you keep it secret if you can. And once you're settled so that you have your space that you can go to, and you have your place that you can get meals, and your problem is solved. So the idea of going to a shelter where someone's going to start telling you what to do, and where you have to somehow negotiate with 20, 30, 50 other people, and there's a question about whether you'll actually get kicked out because maybe you say something or you don't do something or whatever it is, that's more uncertainty than simply having this place in the woods where you go at night, even however cold and uncomfortable and all these other things. So it's just I guess what I'm saying is that my role as a provider was to open up possibilities in a future for people. And if I couldn't do that, then I would fail. And it takes a long time. I remember when this 100,000 homes things first began, and we began our own version of it in Evanston. And the very first person that we pulled off the street under that mechanism of looking at people as the highest risk is someone who is actually, you'll love this, we had known him for years. He was born in Sweden. He had gone, when he was about 20 years old, he'd moved to Australia. The first Gulf War was on, and the Australians sent a contingent of Australians to the first Gulf War, and he joined, and he went to the first Gulf War. And he was there for a number of months, and then they had to fly him home, because that was a relatively short war. And the route that they took put him into the Glenview Naval Air Base. And he got off the plane there for refueling, and he looked around and he said, this is a great place. I'm going to stay here. So he ended up in kind of Cook County, living for the next 17 years on the street. And he found a way to survive. We had known him for years. To tell you the truth, we had known him so many years that no one knew anything about him anymore. We didn't know he was Swedish. We didn't know that he spoke Swedish. We took him down, when he told us that, we took him down to the Swedish consulate. They didn't believe it until he started speaking Swedish. You know, how many homeless people do you know who speak Swedish? So that was our solution, was to get him off and back to Sweden. But I guess my whole point is just simply, you can't carry some of these assumptions that we have about who is homeless and why they're homeless into too far in these conversations, because it's a very complicated issue. Yeah.
I agree with your approach. It's very refreshing because I don't think we look at motive. Sometimes when we're in to help people, it gets frustrating. You meet a lot of people who just want us to build the system for money. They don't care how they get their next drug, how they get their next fix. Then you meet people who are legitimately struggling, who are PhDs, who are out of work, or who are nurses and doctors, but they're out of work. And we assume that because someone's educated, it means they don't need help. And we assume that because somebody's achieved, they don't need help. And I've met people across the board, including myself. And I have struggles too, but they assume, oh, she lives in Lake Forest, her parents are engineers, chemists, they don't have an issue. When you have homeless people or drug addicts milking the system, and my parents go to work every day, 8 to 11 hour days, 60, 80-hour work weeks, they have a hard time justifying helping other people because they did it on their own. They were self-made. But I think in your approach, it's true, it's the mentality we have to tackle first. And it's a hard time to get through to people who are looking just for their next meal or their next paycheck. But it's a range. There's homeless people who are legitimately on the street who have no job or prospect, and there are people who are homeless who have had every opportunity but don't want to take it. They just want to live the lifestyle they live. So,
Right.
I
Well,
liked how you touched on.
okay.
I agree with you.
I'll stop. Let me just make just one comment about it. I'm glad that you heard some of the things I was saying. Personally, I would say people with drug addiction, mental illness, those are diseases. They're homeless not because they're milking the system. Milking the system is just simply a way of survival. They don't have control over themselves the way you might want them to have. And this is all the more reason we are paying for their homelessness. We pay, I mean, no one's run numbers kind of on cost, but these costs of chronic homelessness, of people who are constantly out there, drug addicts, mentally ill, it's costing us somewhere around $50,000 a year so that they have the privilege of living on the street. That's mind-boggling. That's because they're the ones that are in the hospitals. They're the ones that are in the jails. They're the ones that are constantly using the emergency services because they're killing themselves. And we're supporting them in that destructive path. Getting them off the street and into housing will save us lots of money and may, in fact, save their lives.
There's no longer any questions from the audience. We actually took 3.
John, I have one.
That's what I was elected official said.
Very interesting. Of course, because of PADS and talking to Joe Williams about issues that have been plaguing our community, I found it very interesting that you would mention the fact that you took people that had gone through the service organizations such as PADS and worked themselves through the different social organizations to get the help they needed, fared no better than the ones who went directly into the housing. Now, is there an explanation to that? Do you know why that's occurring?
Yeah, what I say, what I've always felt about this is that survival in an apartment is a life skill. But like swimming, it's not something that you learn in a classroom. It's not something you can learn kind of someone telling you how to do it. You have to do it. The time to be supporting people and providing the support services is when they've moved into the housing. Because that's where they have to learn how to become tenants. They have to learn how to take care of themselves. They have to learn how to support themselves. You can have all the programs you want while they're living on the street or they're in a shelter, and it still becomes a big leap when they go into an apartment and they're trying to survive on their own. So, in truth, this is what Housing First has changed. It used to be that we were trying to create housing readiness through a continuum of care. And I mean, I was as much a part of that as anyone, from the early 80s to the time that the McKinney-Vento was passed. I supported that whole notion of a continuum of care and gradually giving people skills. But somehow, that leap, it's a leap. When you go from being homeless and living in a shelter, living even in transitional housing, to finally being on your own. And we weren't providing the support at the right time. We were providing the support in anticipation, thinking, well, we went to school, they told us, kind of trained us up, and then we did it on our own. That isn't how it works. It's when they move into the housing, that's when you really need to double down on the amount of support services that are there, because that's how they learn. They have to learn in the process of doing it.